But before we go into the new, maybe Steve, do you remember any of the other standards that were part of the regular book at that time, or were there any at all when you started at the Jazz Gallery in the beginning of '60 with Train?
Yes, I think I've got a list at home, but as I recall, we did Body and Soul.
In the way that he recorded
yes,
it?
we did, but not for me, using that formulaic, those changes, those giant step kind of changes interspersed.
Mm-hmm.
I Can't Get Started, also, oh dear, and we, Countdown and Tune Up, of course, that was using the formula. There was another standard. I Want to Talk About You. He played that as well. Off the top of my head, that's all I can remember. And then the rest were just the originals from the Giant Steps album. And then The Night Has a Thousand Eyes, we did that. Impressions, of course.
Right.
Which we talked about, because I don't think he knew that theme came from the Morton Gould Pavane at that time, and I brought that out to him.
You knew it?
Yes.
You're talking about the B theme on the bridge. Right. Okay.
That one. Right. Yeah, I mean, that's where he got it from, and he wasn't, I don't think he was aware of where he'd heard it. Mm-hmm. And I just said, did you know that was, along with the middle part of Have You Met Miss Jones? Those were my two contributions. But there was, that's, listen, it's music, and wherever it comes from, it comes. And
right.
I mean, he merely made that little melodic thing. He just made that. It's been, now it's such an influential those recordings of that song, Impressions, would just have been so instrumental and innovative in a way. And,
I think the scholarship on Impressions has gone both ways as far as trying to trace back the sources to the nth degree, which has maybe finally been pinned down by people like yourself as the early pioneer, and then up through modern times, Louis Porter's excavations for it. But also the fascinating part about trying to figure out how it evolved in Train's hands. Like we used to think that the first time Impressions shows up is the Village Vanguard, almost 2 years after you were working with him, and then it's moved back to, he played it at Newport in '61 and recorded it there. And interestingly, somebody must have told the announcer who's going to bring on Train. He says, some of our listeners may have heard this earlier today, perhaps even you, saying, John Coltrane's going to come on, and he'd like to start with Miles Davis's piece, So What? And instantly they go into Impressions, which of course is a new melody on the same structure as So What. And there is a body of recordings that Steve Kuhn, who's our guest on the John Coltrane Festival here, has pointed to, and I don't know if enough has been made of it, that I hope someday the world has greater access to, that are the home recordings made by a saxophonist with the Woody Herman Orchestra and a Coltrane enthusiast and an educator in his own right named Frank Tiberi, who had the prescience in his early times to chase Train and to chase him with a microphone.
Yep.
And managed to come up with a lot of extraordinary outcomes in music that prove a lot of points, including that what Steve Kuhn is telling us in no uncertain terms now is actually documented a little bit later in the year, that Coltrane actually performed and now we know recorded, even though we can't bring that to you right now, this theme that he called Impressions by that point. Mm-hmm. Was he calling it Impressions, or did he call it anything? Did he call it So What?
I don't recall.
Because he finally did make a studio recording of it almost 2 years later, and by that time he wasn't even calling it Impressions. He just called it Excerpt, like as though there wasn't yet a name for it, but that's well after. It's a long way down the road.
I don't know. I don't remember. I really don't remember. It may have been, when I was with him, it may have still been So What. I don't know. I'm not sure. I shouldn't say.
I think the point was made in some earlier research that the piece Countdown that we know from that whole body, the first folio of Coltrane's breakthroughs, mm-hmm. he must have referred to as Tune-Up sometimes, at least, in handing that out to you.
Yes.
Referring to its source in Eddie Benson's.
I have that written out in my notebook that he wrote, and I believe it's Countdown, because I think that's what he called it on the He did record it on the Giant Steps recording?
Yeah.
So it's Countdown.
Yeah. That had already gotten a new name.
Yes.
Well, you mentioned this idea of Coltrane applying the sort of Giant Steps formula, or at least the advancement of Giant Steps, to standard literature.
Mm-hmm.
Did that seem like it was, how do you say this? We hear a lot of examples, and maybe even you pointed to some in the European recordings of Train with Miles Davis, of where he's almost in an experimental zone within his own improvisations, where, for instance, some people theorize that if you're playing on the bandstand, that's when you make the breakthrough, and others will say, well, you're not going to play anything on the bandstand that you haven't already broken through to in your own practice time. My question, I guess, has to do with whether applying the fast-paced, all-encompassing harmonic understanding that's embodied in Giant Steps, laying that on standard literature, was that something where Train seemed to be almost like challenging himself? Was it something he was trying to work out or to prove that was uniformly applicable? Did he really feel like that was his natural expression to enhance those pieces? Because obviously he had played all those standards in a much more balladic rendering.
I think whenever he encountered a standard, and there was essentially stagnation harmonically for 4 bars or 8 bars, he could put this formula in, which is what he did with any number of these songs. And it was sort of an exercise for him to do that.
Right.
And so I'm sure he worked that out at home.